Hello everyone, AmyR here with Prairie Paper and Ink. For my card today, I am using the Up and Away stamp set again because I'm obsessed with it. And I thought today I would make a slimline card. So there are no set measurements for slimline cards, whereas, you know, A2 is 4 1/4 by 5 1/2, A4 is this, etc., etc. With slimline, there's all kinds of measurements out there. I generally keep it easy and I slice a piece of 8 1/2 by 11 cardstock at 7 inches. And then I score it like I show here at 3 1/2 inches. So this ends up being 3 1/2 inches by 8 1/2 inches. And this will fit easily in a business envelope and it just works. So you can, again, you can fuddle with with those measurements and cut in different ways and make it, 9 inches by 4 and that sort of thing. I just found it's easier to do it this way. So I cut my card base and then I cut a piece of Ranger watercolor paper to around the same size. I'm going to cut it down in a bit, but it's, about the same size, roughly like 3 1/2 by 8 1/2. And then I put it in my waffle flower water media mat here just to kind of hold it a little better in place. And I have a whole bunch of Distress oxide inks and my mini ink blending tools because I want to create sort of a sunset sort of background with those. So I am going to heavily ink blend this ink onto the smooth side of this watercolor paper, starting with mustard seed along the bottom. And then I'm going to blend abandoned coral into that. I'll kind of go back and forth so that I can like smooth out the blend between the colors, and it also kind of creates this pretty shade of orange. And then I've sped this up in editing. It still didn't take very long though, because oxide inks on the Ranger Distress watercolor paper just blend like butter. So for the top color, I use Seedless Preserves. And at this point I have a little bit of Post-it tape on my fingers just so I don't get fingerprints on this while I'm blending. And then I'm going to add just a bit of clean water and splatter that all over the background with a paintbrush. I let that sit for 15-20 seconds. Just kind of depends. Let it sit for a bit, and then I just use a paper towel to pick up that moisture, and then I get that gorgeous splatter effect. Love. So I'm going to have to set this aside to let it completely dry because the oxides do take longer to dry. So while it's doing that, I am going to white heat emboss the hot air balloons from the Up and Away stamp set onto more Ranger watercolor paper, again using the smooth side. So I have the smooth side facing up. I use my anti-static powder tool, brushed away the excess, and then I'm inking up the hot air balloons with a clear embossing ink. And then I'm going to stamp them a couple times just to make sure I get a good impression of everything. And then I'm going to coat these with white embossing powder and melt that with my heat tool. So of course it looks white on white, nothing exciting. So I'm going to do that, and off camera I ended up doing a third, like another of the small ones, because I'm going to use that for the inside of the card. But for now I just have the 2 hot air balloons, and then once these are all completely melted, I am going to paint these with more Distress oxide inks. So I'm just going to keep using my water media mat here and just smushing the inks directly onto the media mat. You could use any non-porous surface. I've also pressed really well onto the lids, kept the lid on and pressed down with the lid. I've shown that in other videos, and then just use the lid sort of as a palette, whatever works. So I just smushed the inks onto there, and then I'm just picking up the ink with a water brush and just painting each of the sections of the hot air balloons. That's why I white heat emboss them, because in this way I don't have to worry about, a section needing to dry before going to the next one so that things don't bleed into each other, because the raised edges of that heat embossing keeps everything a little more contained. So I went with more sort of pastel-y colors, and I went with like greens and purples and yellow just to give a nice contrast to what'll be the background. So I just painted each section with that water brush. And then with all of these, I did Squeezed Lemonade, Shaded Lilac, Cracked Pistachio, and Peacock Feathers. And then I just used the Squeezed Lemonade for the little basket on the hot air balloons as well. So got those completely painted in with the Distress oxide inks, and then I'm going to die cut them with the coordinating wafer dies. And like I said, I did a third one. So I die cut all of those. And then off camera, I also stamped, there's outline cloud images in the Up and Away set. So I'd stamp those onto vellum and white heat emboss them as well, and then die cut them with the coordinating wafer dies. It's got a bunch of cute little clouds with vellum. And then I also die cut some white cardstock with more of the cloud dies from the Up and Away coordinating set, as well as the large clouds wafer dies from Honeybee. So I've got just a pile of clouds here. So I've got all my clouds, I have my hot air balloons, and then I'm going to need to do some sentiments. So before I get to the sentiments though, one, I got to put away all these stamps because I'm using a couple stamp sets. I have all these dies, pieces of die cuts. I have a mess. That's just what happens. So I'm going to trim down the background now because it's fully dry. So I'm just going to trim it down to slightly smaller than the card. The card is, again, 3.5 by 8.5. So I trim this down to about 3.25 by 8.25, roughly. So that way there'll be a little bit of the white border of the card base. So I trim that down. I did fiddle and like kind of figure out where I'm going to place everything because, you know, I want all those clouds and hot air balloons, all that. So had a rough idea of what I was going to be doing. And then I pulled out some black cardstock and the coordinating blown away stamp set. And I lined up the sentiments that I wanted to use on the card onto this black cardstock. And I spaced the lower two apart because I'm going to die cut those. And then same thing. Anti-static powder tool, brush off the excess. I'm going to ink up the stamps with the clear embossing ink. And then stamp these onto the black cardstock. And then I'm going to white heat emboss these as well. So once these are stamped, and I like to stamp them twice, just because more often than not, especially when I'm sending multiples all on one piece, you know, you think you got it all and you missed it, and then you pour the heat embossing powder on and you see what you missed. So stamping it more than once usually helps. So after I stamped everything, coated it with that detail white embossing powder. And then I'm going to melt that with my heat tool and always tilting it back and forth in the light to make sure everything is smooth and glossy and raised. If anything looks grainy or dull, it hasn't been melted. So again, another one of those things that if I'm not paying enough attention, I end up getting to the end of the card and have wiped off part of the embossing because I didn't melt it. So always tilting it back and forth in the light to make sure, because yeah, I almost always miss a spot. So I got that all melted, and then the top sentiment I'm just going to trim off with my paper trimmer. So I'm just going to line that up. That's why I lined up the sentiments straight right along the top, just to make it easy so I could quickly trim this down. So trim that one with my paper trimmer, and then the other two I'm using the coordinating wafer die set for the blown away stamp set. So I'm going to line up those wafer dies, tape them down with washi tape, and then run those through my die cut machine. So once I've got everything die cut, everything's stamped, everything's colored, the backgrounds are done, I've got a whole pile of die cuts here. Now it's time to start actually assembling this card front. So I fiddled around yet again, just kind of figuring out what I was going to do. And then what I end up doing is I'm going to adhere everything with a combination of craft tacky glue as well as foam squares. So I get the dimension and everything else. So with everything going on right now in the world, I thought a card like this, ones like this are nice if you want to, you know, send to a hospital ward or a group of people. You know, there's so many people to send thank you cards to. And I was thinking cards like this that are larger gives a lot of place for like a whole bunch of people to sign, you know, and share their thoughts and say thank you, etc., etc. But you could totally recreate this in a smaller, like an A2 version, and not, you know, as many elements. You know, if you wanted to do a whole bunch of cards, instead of sending one to multiple people or whatever, if you wanted to make a bunch of cards, just do them like A2 size with one hot air balloon. You know, you could do a whole bunch of these. It wouldn't take very long. So after I got everything adhered onto the card front, I'm going to adhere this to the base first. Then I'm going to flip this over and just trim off all the bits that are hanging off the edge with scissors, using the card base as my guide to trim all of that off. So just trimmed everything down. So then I've got my whole little scene here. And then on the inside, I'm going to adhere that blown away by your kindness sentiment, and then the third hot air balloon. So get that adhered into place, and then adhere the balloon. And then as a final bit of embellishment, I'm going to add some sequins. These are just some majestic clear sequins from Studio Katia. And the thing I like with sequins or any sort of embellishment is when you're dealing with vellum and adhering it, you can use the embellishments to hide any glue spots if you accidentally get any, because it shows through vellum. So I strategically placed a couple of the sequins to cover those up, and then it's good to go. Plus they have that bling that I love. So once I get these all adhered into place with the craft tacky glue and my embellishment wand, I like to, with sequins especially, make sure they're pressed down and flat so they can adhere, and then they're good to go. So that finished off my card for today. As always, I will have a link below the video to the blog post. I'll have a supply list with links to all the supplies used if you want to check that out. Thank you all so much for watching and thumbs upping and commenting. All of it, I really appreciate it. And I will see you all very soon in the next video. Bye!